All right, hey guys. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to go from a regular to-do app to a distributed web to-do app. Basically, we are going to be ending up with something that's going to be very similar to Textile's JS Threads client. This is just a simple to-do app. The code is going to be mostly the same as theirs at the end of this, so if you just want to see, more or less what it ends up as, you can just go to that repo right there. I'll put the link in the description. Here's their website. They're building a lot of stuff on top of IPFS. One of their major components is called Threads. It's basically like a IPFS database. If you want to persist a single state over time, you don't have to, post up something onto IPFS using your CID, and then, next state somebody has a key down or something like that, and then the state of your app changes and the hash completely changes of the whole state, and you need to find a new CID and post that up there. It can get pretty obnoxious to continuously do something like that. They take the pain out of that whole process, and they'll just persist your state for you in the back end. If you're a front-end developer and it's simple for you to just make backend calls to some API or something like that. They've basically given you that same experience, except now it's in the distributed web, so you don't actually have anybody on call for your server going down or something like that. It's based off of, well, here's kind of what it looks like at the end of it. This is the finished product right here. Just hit foo. And we've got a new item right there. You can delete them. Here is the tutorial that inspired Textile's to-do app. It uses React hooks with Mobx, and it creates a simple to-do list. If you want to run through all of this yourself, that's fine, and you can just skip that video or this video completely. For this first video, I'm going to show you how to build the to-do app. And then in the second video, I'm going to show you how to IPSF-ify it using Textile. So the second video is pretty brief. It's just a couple lines of code, and then you'll take a regular app, and then it'll become a distributed app or a dWeb app. And if you only want to see the dWeb part of it, just go ahead and skip to the second video if you're not super interested in making a to-do app. But if you want to see the whole process, soup to nuts, this is where we're going to start. They're using npx. I'm still on npm, but roughly going to do the same thing. npm create react app, and then give it a name, to do, and then set a template for it to TypeScript. npx probably runs commands, but I have create react app installed globally. If you want to do that, npm install create react app -g, and that'll install it globally, so it's not just in a particular file system or in a subfolder. It'll just be in your path, and you can find it anywhere. And I already had it installed, but if you haven't, you can go ahead and do that now. And we'll say create react app because it's in your path, and to do template TypeScript. And this will create a React app that is using TypeScript, and that is kind of important for this because we are going to take advantage of the TS config. Otherwise, we would have to eject the app if we wanted to get the decorators that we're going to use in this. Okay, cool. So that installed. We can see that we built a project called to do. So we're going to change directories into to do. And then we're going to install some other stuff like TypeScript, and a bunch of types. Okay, we've got our types installed. Last thing is Mobx and Mobx React Lite. Okay, cool. So that's installed. Let's check out our files in here. And we'll bring in the source of this project to Sublime. And we'll also check out the TS config because we're going to need to change that. So here is some of the magic of using TypeScript, which I don't typically use, but again, we don't need to eject the create React app if we use TypeScript because we'll have the TS config to modify here. And we can put in experimental decorators right here. And this allows us to use some of the markup that you're going to see, like some of the @ signs and stuff like that that Mobx uses. But you'll see that in a second. So to kick things off, let's create our Mobx stores. And then we will, as it says here, connect it to our React project. And I'll go ahead and create this folder right here. So we are in to do right here, source, and we'll make a new folder called stores. And inside there, we will save a new file called to-do list. .ts. And this is going to go into source stores. Okay. And inside our to-do list, we are going to have an observable, observable.shallow, and it's going to be a list of type to-do item. We'll define that later. Is equal to just an empty array. And to use some of this stuff, we'll need to import, make a couple imports. So we're going to need some actions in the future and some observables we just created from Mobx, which we installed in npm just a little bit ago. And we'll just leave it for there right now. And this observable is, basically described in the name. It is observable. This is going to be our essentially like the same thing as a store in Redux, but it is a store in Mobx. This is something that you're going to be able to examine and put into or render into a component. And in our constructor, we'll have to-dos, which is an array of strings. And for each of them, we are just going to call this .todo or this .add to do. And we haven't defined that yet, but we will right here. And here's another one of those decorators .action. We brought that up right here up at the top. And this is the equivalent of Redux's reducer. It's just some way of modifying the state. So this action that first one is going to be add to do. And that is, you just set it equal to a function. So we're going to have text, which is a string. And we're just going to say this .list .push new to do item. And we're going to have the text that we have in there. And then we're going to set an ID. And we're just going to have this set to some random number. So math.floor of math.random times some really big number. call toString on that. And then we'll also have is done, which is false. Because when we create a new to-do item, it's not done. So that is our first action. And we'll create a second one. Action remove to-do. That's equal to, we'll pass in a to-do item. And then we'll find it in the list. This.list.splice, this.list.index of to-do. And then splicing it will modify the array in place, and it'll basically just get rid of the item at that index. And then we'll have another one. This one is going to be update. Again, we're passing in a to-do item. And this one is going to be very similar to remove, but we're going to find index equal to this.list.find index item. Give ourselves some more space here. Item.id is equal to to-do.id. And instead of just finding the index of the to-do like above, which would work if you have object equality, this one, when we update it, it's not going to work when we IPFS-ify it with Textile. So I'm just doing this in advance. But we have to use find index instead of index of right here. And so we have our index of where it is in the array, and then we're just going to call this .list.splice. We'll call index. We're overriding 1 with to do, which is the new one we just passed in. Get some semicolons in there, and we are good with our to-do lists. Also, we've referenced some things we haven't built in here yet, so we need to import a to-do item and a to-do type from to-do item. So we will start up a new file here and call this one to-do item. And this is going to be our store for to-do item. And in this one, similar to the last one, we're going to have an action and observable getting imported from Mobx. And we're going to define this type right here. Interface to-do type. Text is going to be a string. ID is going to be a string. And when you're defining an interface, use semicolons. I've never really got that, but that is how it is done. Is done is going to be a Boolean, and that's our interface. So we're going to define our to-do item right here. And it's got an ID, which is a string, and two observables, text, string, set that equal to an empty string, and is done, which is a Boolean. And that's set to false. We've got our constructor right here, and we can pass in a to-do, or rather a to-do type. It's not an actual to-do. It's just the type up there, which is just an object literal with the string ID and is done. And we'll just set all those those properties to this, and that'll be our constructor. So this dot text is equal to to-do.text. This dot ID is equal to to-do.id. And this dot is done is equal to to-do.isDone. Pretty straightforward. And then we have an action which can modify this. called update. And we'll pass in the to-do type again. And this dot type or text is equal to to-do.text. This dot is done is equal to to-do dot is done. And the reason we're not updating the ID here is because if we're just updating it, the ID should stay constant, and we're not changing that with an update. And that is our to-do item. So create context will create a context, and basically that is giving us two things, a provider and a consumer, when we call create context. And that is effectively letting us hook into the state at one point where it's created at another point. So we are going to create a context for our to-do list, which is, basically our main state. We've got our to-do list, which has to-do items in it, and that is the entire state of the app. So if we create a context for a to-do list, and we'll expose the provider and consumer so that we can look at the state in various components. So this is pretty straightforward, just a quick 2 lines here. Export const store context is equal to create context. It is of type to-do list. And we are just going to pass in an empty function as to-do list, because it'll start out blank, and then export const store provider is equal to store context dot provider. And so our context is right here, and then the provider is exporting store context dot provider. This is going to wrap our app. So the entire app is going to be put inside a JSX component of this provider, and that will expose the whole app to the to-do list state. The next helper we're going to make is just simply accessing the enter button. So just call this one use enter.ts. And this is just to recognize when somebody hits enter, we'll just call a callback that gets passed in. So import keyboard event from React. We're going to export const on enter press is equal to callback. We'll just say let's type any, and we will return a function e of type keyboard event. So if the key that gets pressed is equal to enter, then call our callback. Pretty straightforward. We're going to use this a couple times though, so we don't want to type it out over and over again. And we've got one final helper to create here, and that is use store. And so we'll import use context from React. Should probably save this first. Use store.ts. And we'll also import the store context that we just built. And we also import the actual store. It was like the first thing we built. Import to-do list, stores, to-do list. And so here's a function that we are going to define. Use store is equal to a function, and it returns a to-do list. And it is just using the context of store context. So basically what use context does is it allows us to get access to the context that we just created. So effectively, it's giving access to the store that we just created. So in store provider over here, we created this context, which returns our to-do list right here, which is the state of our app essentially. And this function is, we're defining a function right here, which will return a to-do list. We're calling use context, the React hook, and we're passing in the store context. So when you call this function, you will get the to-do list. And we'll use this in our different components. When they get called, they get access to the to-do list. And when the state changes, then those components get re-rendered. And that is how the state flow works. So now that we have our helpers defined, let's go ahead and start creating some components. First of them is going to be the to-do list. So we'll save this as, I need to create a new folder called components. And this will be to-do list.tsx because we will have JSX markup in here and it's TypeScript. So we're going to import React from React. Get some more imports in a second. We want to export a class called to-do list static function. And here's where that use store comes in place. Let's go ahead and import that. First, let's use it. Const to-do list is equal to use store. Now we have access to our state. So import use store from helpers use store. And we're going to return use observer which returns just a JSX component. So use observer allows us to keep track of an object over time. And we do have an object right here, the to-do list that we just got from use store. Object identity is a tricky thing. And if that mutates or anything, like we want to be able to keep track of an object over time and check its calculated properties and everything. So we are using Mobx's use observer. And in the callback function that we're passing to it, we are just going to return this JSX component. And we're going to have to import some more stuff here. We're going to be using semantic UI React from semantic UI React, and we don't have that yet, so let's go ahead and install it. npm I semantic UI React. And while that is going, we can just continue right here. We've got a list, and inside our list we have a to-do new. We haven't created that yet, but we will in a second. Import to-do new from It's going to go into, it's going to be in components. So to do new, it's going to live alongside this to-do list right here. And what else are we going to have in there? We'll have a bunch of to-do items. So to-do list dot list, because if you remember, we'll close a couple of these. To-do item, to-do list. This is our to-do list. This is a class, and it has a property on it called list, which is an array. So our to-do list right here will have a property on it called list, and we can map over that. To do, this is going to return a JSX component. Let's get these aligned right here, which is just a to-do item. We'll give it a key equals to the ID of this to-do. And the to-do is just passed on into the props. Close that out. So we need to import that as well. Import to-do item from to-do item. We will define both of those. And it looks like the JSX linting is going crazy here. I'm not sure. So that does it for our to-do list. And now we will start creating a to-do item. And we will save it as to-do item.tsx. So we'll import React from React, and we'll start with an interface props, which has a single thing on it, which is the to-do that we just passed in. So here is that one property that we passed in, or the one prop, and a to-do is to-do item class. We need to import that from our store. To-do item class from stores to-do item. Export constant to-do item is equal to, we'll destructure our to-do, which is defined by our interface props. And inside this function, again, we're going to have the same thing as last time. We're going to define to-do list is equal to use store. And we should bring that in as well. Import use store from helpers use store. And now we'll have access to the state. We're also going to have new text and set text is equal to use state, and we'll default it to empty string. Use state is a React hook which lets you use React state inside a function component like this. So you can see we've got a constant right here, to do item, and we didn't call it a class. We don't have a constructor, and it's just a function, but we still want to keep track of some state. And by calling use state right here, we have a getter and a setter for this new state that we just created. So new text is the getter, and the set text is, if we want to set that state, we just call that function right there. We also want a second one for editing state. So is editing and set edit is equal to use state, and we're going to set it to false because we're not going to be editing right off the bat. And we'll also create an input ref, and you'll see why in a second. Create ref returns an input. And we need to import create ref as well. Where the fuck is create ref? Oh yeah. And we need to import create ref as well from React. Ref. And also use state while we're at it. Okay, with that done, let's start writing the JSX for this component. So similar to the last to-do list, we're going to use observer. Use observer. And it hasn't been imported, so we need to do that also. Import use observer from Mobx React Lite. And inside of here, we are going to have a list.item. And we need to import some stuff from Semantic UI also. So we are importing button, list, input, and icon from Semantic UI React. So list.item is what's going to be our wrapper for the whole thing, and list.content is going to be inside of that. And this would probably take a while to just mess around with typically, but I already have like the code up in front of me, what it should look like at the end. So I'm just kind of writing it down. List.content. In list.content, which is floated to the right, we're going to have some buttons. First one is our check button. So icon equals check. It's a toggle button. On click, it's going to be we're going to update. So to-do list. Remember, we brought in our store right here on line 12. This is our to-do list. And we are going to call update to-do. And we are destructuring the current to-do. And we are updating the to-do, which is passed in here. So we destructured it up in the props right up here. So that is the to-do in question that we are rendering. And we are going to destructure its properties into here. And is done is just going to be toggled. To do is done. And yeah, that is our onClick. Active is equal to do dot is done. So hopefully that makes sense what this button is doing. We have a second button, which is the close button, or probably closer to what we're using it for is the delete button, but the icon close in Semantic UI has an X on it. On click for this one is going to be similar to the last one. To-do list is going to get called, or to-do list dot remove to-do is going to get called, and we're just going to pass in the to-do. And this one, you know, hopefully it should be obvious that this, when you click on this button, it deletes the to-do that is in question, that has been passed in up on line 11. And for the part that's not floated to the right, so that's like the button area and the text area, we're going to have a second list.content. And this part is going to have an input, or it's going to switch rather. So it's going to either just be some text or an input, but it will be either editable or not, depending upon the state. So in list.content, we'll have input. I think we can do a self-closing tag right here. So it will be fluid, and the ref is equal to the input ref. And this is why we made that input ref above on line 15 here. So we're passing in the ref prop right here is being set to that input ref. Basically, with create ref, which is returning an input type right here, all we're doing is establishing a variable that we can reference later on. So this input is going to get used in our JSX in a second. So icon is equal to, so if we're editing, we want the save button, which it looks like a floppy disk. And if we are not editing, we want the ability to get into the edit state. So we want to see a pencil. So we'll have a ternary operator here on is editing. And if we are editing, we want icon name equals save. And it looks like a link. And on click, we are going to save text. And we have not written that yet, but we'll get to that in a second. And if we are not editing, we want an icon name equals pencil. And it is also a link. And on click, it's equal to a function where we first set edit to true. And we have established set edit. That's up here on line 14. That was our setter for use state, which was initially false. Then when we call set edit, we are setting it to true. And then our input ref dot current and an existential operator. So this is TypeScript magic for if it exists, we'll call the focus method to give it focus as soon as we click on the pencil. Okay, so just a couple more properties to establish on this input. Icon position is equal to left. Read only is equal to if it's editing or not. On key down, we want to on enter press, save text, and we need to import on enter press. That was that helper we created before. So import on enter press from helpers, and I think it's use enter. So remember the way that worked is it checks if the button that's passed into this is it was a higher order function that checks if the event passed into it is enter, and if so, then call the callback. So we have on enter press here, and on change, we want to check, we want to set the text. E target value. And this one is established. That was that other use state we had right here. Set text, and then it's setting new text when we call it. And its value is equal to whether it's editing or not. So is editing, we'll have another ternary operator. It's going to either be the new text if we're editing, or to do dot text if it's empty, or to do dot text. So if they delete, it's going to be new text. If they end up deleting everything, then it will default back to whatever the original text was. To do dot text is what we see if it's not editing. And that is a to-do item. Now that we are done with our components, we have a couple edits to make to app and index. And we'll start with app right here. So it's actually, if you were to load it up right now, I'm sure it's probably broken in some way. But actually, let's go ahead and try that. See if it even compiles. npm start. And maybe it will work, or maybe it will break and give us an error or something. We'll do debugging at the end, but I'm just curious to see if it actually runs. Hey, there we go. No, this is the old one. Yeah, because we haven't edited app or index or whatever. It's still building. This is just what's cached from before. Failed to compile. Okay, well, you saw a flash of it there on the screen. It was basically just like a React logo. And yeah, we want to change that. So it's actually a to-do list. And we're going to get rid of all of this actually. So we've got the div, which just wraps the whole thing. Bring in a header as h2. We need to import a header component and icon from semantic UI React. And then inside the header, we've got an icon. Name is check. And we've got header content. And it says to-do app. And then we have a to-do list, which we also need to import. From components to-do list. And that should do it for our app. We also need to modify index.tsx. So right here we have just rendering the app, and we also want to wrap our app in our store provider, as we mentioned before. So right here, we will say, first we'll make a to-do list. To list is equal to new. I'm actually going to copy this in from the already created one. If you're a Venture Bros fan, you'll recognize this to-do list. I think I'm actually missing one too. Make everything go my way. Awesome. And in our React DOM, we're going to render not just this app, but we want it to be wrapped in our store provider. We're going to give it a value of the initial to-do list that we just created. So this is just our first store provider. Okay, and then the app goes in the middle right there. And that is all we need to do. So let's start debugging. One last thing, we also need to import a couple things. So we need some CSS for semantic UI. Semantic UI CSS / semantic.min.css. And we haven't installed that yet. So let's Control-C to kill our server, and then npm install semantic UI CSS. We also want to bring in the to-do list. So we use the constructor right here on line 9. We haven't imported it. And that comes from stores to-do list. And I think that should be everything. Store provider. No, we haven't imported that either. So import store provider from helpers store provider. And that should be everything. To-do list, store provider. Yeah, I think that's it. And now on to debugging. We can run npm start again. And I know we had that error. Let's pull up the file explorer here, and I think it was in our stores we had an issue. Yeah. So this should only have one set of curly braces. From to-do item, we'll pull up to-do item right here and show you that we're exporting a to-do type and a to-do item as default. So in our to-do list, when we import, the to-do item doesn't need to be in curly braces and the to-do type does, because this is a named and this is the default. So the to-do new component is going to be where you enter a new to-do item. It's just going to be an input, and then if you hit enter, it gets added. So we're going to import React. From React, we will create a new constant, export const to-do new, and we are going to have some more React hooks on here. Const new to-do, set to-do is equal to use state, and like before, this is setting our value empty, or our value initially to an empty string, and here are our getter and setter. New to do is the getter, set to do is the setter, and we are going to get our store. To-do list is equal to use store, and we need to import that. So import use store from helpers use store, and we've got an add to do function here. which we need to check if it actually has anything in it first. If new to do dot trim, so this just gets rid of the white space on either end of the string, is equal to an empty string, and just return. Otherwise, to-do list, our store up here, we're going to call add to do, and we'll pass in new to do, which is just a string. And then we will set to do to an empty string again, because once we add something, there's an expectation that the input field is reset. So here's our function to add a to-do, and we need a JSX component now. So list.item list.item is going to be our wrapper, and we need to import some more stuff from Semantic UI React. So we'll need a list, button, and an input from Semantic UI React. List.item is the wrapper. We need to have a list.content inside of here. And we'll have a button inside of that. The button is just a plus button. Name, oh yeah, icon equal plus. On click is equal to add to do, which we just defined above. For our second piece of content in this item, list.content, we have an input. And in the input, we're going to call it fluid so that it stretches with the screen. Placeholder is going to be set to enter to do item. Our value is equal to new to do. That's part of our use state hook up at the top. And on key down, we want to handle this with on enter press. Our callback is going to be add to do. And we also need to import on enter press from helpers, and it was called use enter. And on change, we will pass in a function which calls set to do with target value. And this is just going to call that setter that we established up here, set to do. And I think this should be good for this component. And I think I talked about making a function, but we never did it in to-do item. Set edit, input ref. Yeah, one of these is missing, I think. We'll probably see in a second here. Let's see, what does this say? Module has no exported member to do item class. Did you mean to use import to do item class instead? To do item.tsx in components. Okay, so I see we probably should have not put this in curly braces because we wanted the default export from stores to do item. Stores to do item is right here, and the default is just the class. And we're looking for the class for our interface. So let's see what we have now. Yeah, I think this is what we were missing in components to do item on line 36. It says save text, and we never defined our action right here. Or we never defined our function right here. So let's do that right now. Const save text is equal to arrow function, and in here we are going to update the to-do. We'll pass in our destructured to-do. That's again coming from line 12 right here. This is the one that's being rendered in this component. And then the text is going to be new text. And that is from our hook right here, our state hook. Once we have updated the to-do, we need to set edit to false. So we're not in the editing state. And then set text to empty string. And that is our save text function. Cannot find name use state. Let's see. This is in to do new. Oh, right. So I think we forgot that right there. Okay, how are we doing? We have something that does not look good. I think we were missing some CSS here. So I'm just going to paste in some CSS that makes it look nice. I'm not going to be covering CSS in detail here, so you'll have to forgive me for just skipping over this part. Index.css. Yeah, I think that looks good. Still something wrong here. So it looks like the buttons are not floating to the right for each to-do item. So let's check out components, to-do item, and I think this should be floated instead of float. All right, there we go. And then on our to-do new, I think that's the same thing. Yeah, list content should be floated equals right. And as soon as that clicks into place, cool. So let's add a new item. It looks like it works. We can check things, uncheck them. Yeah, it looks like we are good to go. So that is the basics of using Mobx and React hooks via the Create React App template using TypeScript. And from this point, we've got a basic to-do app. In the next step, we are going to change that into persisting the state with IPFS and Textile so that we can save between sessions. I'll see you in the next one.